In the early hours of September 1st, 1983, Korean Airlines Captain Chung Byung guided his Boeing 747 through the vast, starless expanse of the North Pacific. For half a decade, Byung had flown this same path countless times. Flight 007 was a demanding 4,000-mile tower journey from Anchorage, Alaska, to Seoul, South Korea. Captain Byung, once a pilot in the Korean Air Force, brought not only discipline and years of experience, but also the confidence of someone backed by a state-of-the-art navigation system and a capable, seasoned crew. For him, this route was routines so ingrained in muscle memory that he could almost have flown it in his sleep. With the autopilot engaged, he technically could. On board, 246 passengers and 23 crew members filled the cabin. The majority were Koreans traveling home, but among them were several dozen American citizens and a handful of passengers from Japan, Taiwan, and other countries. The flight was so unremarkably ordinary that the captain and his first officer casually passed the time by chatting with the pilots of another aircraft trailing minutes behind them. Their conversation drifted into small talk, including plans to take time off and enjoy the turning autumn leaves. But at about 3:25 a.m. local time, the Boeing approached Sakhalin Island in the northern Pacific. Inside the warm, insulated cockpit, Byung and his officers sat unaware that they were being closely monitored. Their false sense of ease was about to shatter. They had no idea their aircraft had strayed entirely off course and was now trespassing into one of the most sensitive regions of Soviet airspace in the Russian Far East. Without warning, the plane jolted violently. Its oxygen masks tumbled from overhead compartments, dangling before shocked passengers as panic erupted. The cabin depressurized, the air rushing outward as though an invisible force had torn open the fuselage. In the cockpit, Captain Byung felt the sudden drop in temperature as alarms screamed around him. The flight engineer checked his gauges and confirmed that all 4 engines were still functioning normally. Whatever had happened, it was not an engine explosion. Byung's thoughts raced. The aircraft was falling out of his control. His first officer quickly radioed Tokyo Air Traffic Control, reporting a rapid and catastrophic decompression. Fighting the yoke, Byung attempted to descend toward a lower altitude, to quell, where the effects of decompression would be less deadly. But the aircraft refused to respond, as it had so many times before, under his steady hand. From the cabin, the agonized screams of terrified passengers echoed, and for the first time, there was nothing he could do. For 6 long minutes, the Boeing spiraled downward in darkness, plummeting from 35,000 feet before crashing violently into the Sea of Japan. There were no survivors. The tragedy of Flight 007 would soon spark a chain of events that pushed the world dangerously close to the brink of World War III. In the early 1980s, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union burned hotter than it ever had. Tensions between the superpowers fueled a relentless arms race that placed a staggering 18,400 nuclear warheads in opposition. America's president, Ronald Reagan, was a staunch anti-communist who publicly branded the Soviet Union the evil empire. On the other side, the Soviets were led by Yuri Andropov, a lifelong communist who harbored a deep, abiding suspicion of the United States. Within this volatile powder keg, the world stood on the verge of a moment that could have ignited a nuclear conflict capable of erasing humanity with a single decision. Yet one man, in an act both defiant and courageous, would stop catastrophe. He would do the unthinkable in military tradition. He would ignore a direct order to launch weapons. His name was Stanislav Petrov, a Russian officer. As a Marine, I can tell your obedience to orders is drilled into us from day one. It is more than just protocol. It is the backbone of military service. I cannot even begin to imagine the burden of receiving an order to fire nuclear missiles and then choosing to disobey it. The weight of that choice is almost impossible to fathom. Yet Petrov's refusal to comply, the reality that the world had come within a hair's breadth of nuclear annihilation, remained hidden until the mid-1990s, when the collapse of the Soviet Union finally allowed his story to be told. In the early months of 1982, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov walked the long corridor of a top-secret Soviet military bunker. At 43 years old, he served in the Soviet Air Defense Force. The facility, known as Serpukhov 15, was located about 80 miles south of Moscow, surrounded by barbed wire and heavily guarded by hundreds of armed soldiers. Inside, soldiers used satellites to monitor the globe for any sign of missile launches, especially from American soil. Petrov's critical responsibility was to oversee and interpret incoming satellite data. Any suspected missile sighting triggered an urgent process of verification. If a launch was confirmed, Serpukhov's commanders would then decide whether to retaliate. Thankfully, up until that point, Petrov had never been forced to make that fateful call. After keying in his security code, he entered a dim, cavernous room dominated by a massive screen displaying grainy satellite images of Earth. Below it, rows of soldiers hunched over bulky computer monitors, their faces lit in pale fluorescent light. Conversations hushed as Petrov stepped into the control center, every eye turning toward him. Though not physically imposing, Petrov commanded respect. He credited that less to his military background and more to lessons from childhood, when he often mediated arguments on the soccer field. After graduating from a technical engineering college, Petrov joined the Soviet Air Defense System not as a pilot, but as a specialist in the growing field of radar and satellite systems. He had a talent for understanding complex networks and a temperament that allowed him to stay calm under extreme stress. Over time, both peers and superiors came to rely on his technical expertise, and he quickly earned a reputation as one of the most capable officers in his unit. Early in his posting at Serpukhov 15, Petrov asked a fellow officer a provocative question. How could they truly distinguish a real missile strike from a drill when the images on their screens appeared nearly identical? The officer replied bluntly, "We do our duty." The words stayed with Petrov, impressing upon him the immense responsibility of his role, to execute his task with precision, no matter the circumstances swirling around him. Sitting at his post, deep underground, Petrov felt as though he were exactly where he belonged. Above his station, a small screen displayed information from the satellite system he worked with, known as Okowich in Russian Mentai, an apt name for the satellites tasked with watching over the planet. He powered on his console and resumed his duties, aware that in many ways, the fate of the Soviet Union and perhaps the entire world rested in the vigilance of that room. Meanwhile, in the basement of the West Wing of the White House, President Ronald Reagan entered the Situation Room. It was March 1st, 1982, and Reagan was there to observe a military exercise codenamed Ivy League 82. At 71, Reagan was only in his second year as president, less than a year after surviving an assassination attempt that had left him shot and hospitalized. Having recovered, he now faced a world still teetering on the knife's edge of nuclear war. The Soviets showed no signs of halting their buildup of weapons, and the United States matched them step for step, pushing both nations further into an arms race spiraling out of control. Reagan settled into a large mahogany table as his senior advisors from both the White House and the Pentagon gathered in heavy leather chairs, their faces grim with seriousness. The Situation Room itself was not much to look at: wooden walls, several television monitors, but the decisions made there could determine the future of the planet. It was the chamber where the President and his National Security Council would convene in times of crisis to deliberate responses to any emergency. On this day, there was no actual crisis, but the Ivy League 82 exercise was designed to simulate one, testing America's ability to maintain command and control in the chaos of a nuclear conflict. Reagan's new National Security Advisor, William Clark, silenced the room. The drill began. On a large projection screen, a map of the United States lit up with red dots, each one representing a Soviet missile strike. The first strikes targeted Washington, D.C., then New York City, a mere 3-hour train ride away. More red points followed, hitting Chicago, Los Angeles, Detroit, and then critical military bases across the country. Soon after, Miami, Philadelphia, Boston, and San Francisco were lit in red. Within minutes, the entire United States was covered in virtual destruction. And then the simulation escalated further. The Soviets launched a second wave of missiles, filling in whatever areas remained untouched. In a real scenario, nearly every American would be dead within 30 minutes. Even knowing it was a drill, Reagan was shaken. The scale of destruction, the speed of it, unsettled him deeply. Later that same night, Reagan returned to the Situation Room for another exercise. This time, learning how he would identify himself to the Pentagon with secret codes, if he chose to authorize a nuclear strike. The gravity of his role weighed heavily. This wasn't merely theoretical. The president had the power to annihilate tens of millions of people on the other side of the world. Despite the sheer horror of nuclear war, Reagan believed backing down or attempting to ease tensions would only embolden the Soviets. He felt the only way to prevail was through strength, through overwhelming military pressure that would force the Soviet Union into submission. His defense secretary vowed to rearm America, and under Reagan, the nation embarked on the largest peacetime military buildup in its history. In the Situation Room, Reagan now understood the terrifying consequences of that buildup. Destruction on a scale humanity had never before known. By June of 1982, Major Oleg Gordievsky arrived at the Soviet embassy in London. After showing his passport and ID badge, he entered the guarded compound in Hyde Park, climbing 3 flights of stairs and walking through long hallways. He noted stern Russian language signs posted everywhere. Do not speak names or dates aloud. At last, he reached an office where he underwent an orientation. Gordievsky, an officer of the KGB, the Soviet Union's powerful security agency, was being assigned to his new post in Britain. Repeatedly, he was reminded that computers and electronic typewriters were forbidden within embassy grounds, as they were too easily compromised by Western spies. He was also warned to remain vigilant for bugs, microphones, and hidden devices in every space. Paranoia saturated the embassy. Gordievsky was already accustomed to suspicion, having trained in Moscow and worked in Copenhagen. But the obsession with espionage in London was extreme. At every turn, embassy staff were told that Britain's intelligence service, MI6, might be watching. Distrust of colleagues, friends, even family was encouraged. The warning extended absurdly to Petzold. They too could be used as conduits for surveillance. Out of this atmosphere of fear had grown a new intelligence program, Operation RYAN, initiated by Yuri Andropov before becoming Soviet leader. Its mission was to detect any hint that the U.S. or its allies were preparing a nuclear strike. Gordievsky had been sent to London to work on this operation, but he had another secret assignment, one punishable by death if discovered. Just weeks after settling in, Gordievsky waited until his office emptied for lunch. Quietly gathering documents, he left, parking far from his destination and concealing the diplomatic plates on his car. He slipped into a discreet West London flat where a scheduled meeting awaited. These meetings never lasted more than 50 minutes, so he could return without arousing suspicion. Inside, he met with 2 British MI6 officers. Gordievsky was a double agent. Recruited 8 years earlier, he had secretly supplied MI6 with intelligence ever since. At the flat, an MI6 staff member photographed the documents he had smuggled, while Gordievsky shared updates on Soviet activities. This time, he revealed extensive details about Operation Ryan. He explained how the KGB was combing for any sign that Britain, America's closest EI, might be preparing for war. Atia tracked troop deployments, political travel schedules, even new road construction. Officially, his job as a Soviet agent was to arrange political contacts and cultivate journalists hoping to gather bits of useful information. But Gordievsky suspected the anxious Soviet leadership would twist every scrap of data into proof of their fears. In such a paranoid state, even ordinary road work could be misinterpreted as evidence that the West was mobilizing for attack. He predicted his superiors would begin to see threats everywhere, whether real or imagined. On September 14, 1982, President Reagan sat in the Oval Office across from Edward Teller, physicist and engineer, famously known as the father of the hydrogen bomb. Teller introduced Reagan to a radical idea, a third generation of nuclear defense, involving X-ray lasers placed in space to intercept enemy missiles before they reached American soil. It sounded like science fiction, but Teller insisted it was possible. Having recently witnessed Ivy League 82, Reagan was more terrified than ever by the prospect of nuclear war. Yet Teller's vision suggested a defensive strategy that could give the United States a decisive advantage. Reagan asked his advisors to investigate further. 6 months later, by February 1983, the U.S. Navy confirmed to Reagan that Teller's theory could indeed work. Computers, lasers, and particle beam technologies had advanced enough to make space-based defense plausible. Reagan was thrilled. Despite objections from his advisors, he insisted on unveiling the plan publicly. On March 23, 1983, Reagan addressed the nation live from the Oval Office, announcing what he called the Strategic Defense Initiative. He painted a vision of a world where free people would no longer depend on the threat of retaliation for safety, but could instead intercept incoming nuclear missiles before they struck. The press quickly nicknamed it Star Wars. The Kremlin reacted with alarm. If America could neutralize Soviet missiles with space-based defenses, then Moscow's nuclear arsenal would be rendered useless. In such a scenario, what would stop the U.S. from launching a massive first strike? The Soviets saw it as an intolerable threat. By late August 31, 1983, just 6 months after Reagan's announcement, Major Gennady Osipovich of the Soviet Air Force prepared for his night shift. Stationed at a major naval base on Sakhalin, Russia's largest island in the Far East, just north of Japan, Osipovich climbed into the cockpit of his Su-15 interceptor jet. Taking command of his squadron, he guided his fleet into the night sky. Up at cruising altitude, Major Gennady Osipovich, an experienced squadron leader, assumed it would be another long night of chasing ghosts, perhaps discouraging foreign aircraft that drew close, but rarely, if ever, crossed into prohibited Soviet skies. For months, he and his squadron had been deployed to intercept American planes flying over the waters east of Soviet territory. Yet, those aircraft always veered away before intruding. To him, these missions had begun to feel like little more than wasted effort. Then, his radio crackled to life. Ground control ordered him to test his guns. It was an unusual command, and usually a sign that live combat might follow. Surprised, Osipovich, nevertheless, obeyed, squeezing the trigger and letting his cannons thunder a burst into the empty night. Everything worked perfectly. Still, he wondered why the test had been demanded. Moments later, ground control delivered another chilling message. An unidentified aircraft was approaching Soviet airspace. The controllers informed him it was most likely a U.S. reconnaissance plane. Instantly, Osipovich's attention sharpened. He checked his radar and moved to intercept. Just after 3 a.m., he drew within 20 miles of the intruder. He attempted to establish contact by following military radio protocol, but there was only silence. Switching to the international emergency frequency and even the military distress channel, he tried, again still no reply. The next order came through. Attempt to force the aircraft to land. Bang! Osipovich flashed his navigation lights and tipped his wings, the standard visual signal for a plane to follow him down. But there was no sign that the other crew had noticed. Reporting back, he heard confusion erupting across ground controls, several voices overlapping at once. Came another directive: fire warning shots. In his 13 years of flying, Osipovich had never been ordered to fire such shots in earnest, but again he complied, losing tracers across the intruder's path. Yet, in the vast darkness, the The foreign aircraft seemed to take no notice. What Osipovich did not realize was that the plane he had been firing toward was not a spy craft at all, but Korean Air Flight 007. Inside its dimly lit cabin, most passengers remained fast asleep, stealing the last precious moments of rest before breakfast service. The long transoceanic journey had been uneventful, broken only by the steady drone of 4 engines. In the cockpit, the crew could see nothing beyond the windows except an endless blanket of ink-black sky. Following their clearance from air traffic control, they adjusted the autopilot for a climb of another 2,000 feet. The 747 ascended slowly, its speed decreasing slightly in the process. The movement was so gradual, not a single sleeping passenger stirred. Back outside, Osipovich's eyes narrowed. On his radar, the mysterious plane was climbing in. Its speed had dropped dramatically. Sudden deceleration caused his fast interceptor to overshoot. His Su-15, built for rapid pursuit, roared ahead of the lumbering giant. Banking hard, he looped back to take another position. To him, it appeared the intruder was deliberately maneuvering evasively. Now, close enough to see details, he noticed the aircraft carried 4 engines. It resembled a large commercial jet, something like an American passenger liner, but he could not comprehend why a sophisticated plane of that kind would wander so far from its designated route. In the dim light, he could not read the markings on the tail, but he could make out rows of darkened windows. Convinced, he told himself this must be no ordinary passenger jet, but a spy plane disguised to look like one, a tactic the Americans were rumored to use for reconnaissance. Sweat gathered under his helmet. A confrontation now seemed unavoidable. For nearly 10 minutes, he shadowed the plane, positioning himself behind it, awaiting the next order. The time was running out. The intruder was edging toward the boundary, almost clear of Soviet skies. With each second, his chance of intercepting slipped away. He knew the command was climbing the chain of authority from captains to colonels to generals, and finally it arrived. Destroy the target. Osipovich held his breath, then pressed the launch controls. 2 missiles streaked forth, one heat-seeking, the other radar-guided. Each warhead carried 88 pounds of explosives. The heat-seeker struck the left wing. The radar-guided missile slammed into the tail. For a brief moment, the stricken jet continued to fly. Then, with grim finality, Osipovich reported back to command. The target had been destroyed. He turned his Su-15 and headed for base. He had just shot down a civilian airliner, Korean Air Flight 007. The following morning, September 1st, 1983, Secretary of State George Shultz rushed to the White House as soon as news of the attack reached Washington. At 10:45 a.m., he went live on national television. His words were stark. The United States, he said, reacted with revulsion to this assault. The loss of life was severe, and in his words, there can be no justification for such a horrifying act. President Reagan himself was furious. Within the White House, the consensus was unanimous. The Soviets had revealed themselves to be merciless and brutal, linked to slaughter innocent civilians. They knew the jet was filled with passengers and fired anyway. Meanwhile, U.S. Air Force intelligence pieced together how the disaster had occurred. Investigators concluded the autopilot on Flight 007 may have been set slightly incorrectly. Over hours, that small error caused the aircraft to drift farther and farther off course without the crew realizing. By grim coincidence, earlier that same day, a genuine American reconnaissance plane had been detected in the same region. The Air Force believed Soviet forces, still on high alert from the sighting, may have mistaken the civilian jet for that spy craft. The warning shots and flashing lights from Osipovich likely went unnoticed by the Korean pilots, who had no idea they had strayed into hostile airspace. Though the truth was heartbreaking, Schultz recognized an opportunity to expose the Soviet Union to the world as villains of the Cold War. Washington quickly suspended all Soviet passenger flights to the U.S. and placed American forces on heightened alert. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov, had been in power less than a year and was hospitalized when the shoot-down occurred. His personal reaction went unrecorded. But other Soviet officials responded immediately, accusing the United States of staging the incident deliberately as a provocation to sabotage Moscow's peace efforts. If tensions between the superpowers had already been high, they now reached a dangerous boiling point. Weeks later, on September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov prepared dinner for his wife, Raisa, gravely ill with cancer. She was bedridden and weak. In their modest, sparsely furnished apartment, Petrov carried a tray to her side, gently feeding her and helping her sip water. Then the phone rang. It was Serpent 15. Another senior officer had fallen sick, and they needed Petrov to cover the night shift. He didn't want to leave his wife, but duty left him no choice. He kissed Raisa goodbye, telling her he hoped she'd rest and that he would see her in the morning. Arriving at the bunker an hour later, Petrov felt the chill of autumn settling in. Inside the underground command center, he took his place before the consoles he knew so well. At midnight, Moscow time, he watched the data streams from Soviet satellites circling 20,000 miles above. All appeared routine. Then, without warning, an alarm shrieked through the room. It was not the familiar tone of an exercise. In giant red letters across the main screen appeared one terrifying word: launch. Petrov froze. The satellites were reporting a missile fired from the west coast of the United States. Hate. It ordered his men to verify. Confirming the computers and their backup systems were functioning normally. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the alarm went silent. Relieved, Petrov exhaled dumbly to see the screen flash again. Missile attack. He searched the satellite visuals for confirmation. A real missile should leave a clear signature. Bright flames, a contrail streaking upward in the first minutes of launch. But the sky was empty. No flashes, no plume. His gut told him the alarm was wrong. Picking up the phone, he reported to High Command that although the system showed a launch, he believed it was a false alarm. Moments later, the alarm blared again. Second missile, then a third. Still, the satellites showed nothing. Then came a fourth, then a fifth. His heart pounded. If the system was correct, American warheads would reach Soviet soil in 8 minutes, obliterating millions. Yet, it made no sense. A first strike, he had always been taught, would come as a massive barrage, not a handful of missiles. He had just minutes left. His men stared at him, waiting. The doctrine hammered into every Soviet officer echoed in his mind. We do our duty. But Petrov hesitated. If he relayed the alerts as genuine, the Soviet Union would retaliate. Nuclear Armageddon would follow. Time ticked away. At the final minute, he made his decision. He chose to trust his instinct, not the machines. He reported the alarms as false. He closed his eyes, bracing for impact, but none came. The world remained intact. Petrov's judgment that night was extraordinary. Calm, rational thinking in the middle of sheer panic. Yet, his story also revealed the peril of depending both on human interpretation and on flawed technology. Blindly following protocol would have meant annihilation. Later, investigations revealed the truth. High-altitude clouds had reflected sunlight, fooling the satellites into reading them as missile flares. It was nothing more than a glitch. But for Petrov, there was no reward. Instead, his superiors reprimanded him for failing to log the events thoroughly. He spent 3 days confined in isolation. In 1984, he was quietly discharged. For more than a decade, the incident remained a tightly guarded Soviet secret. Only in the mid-1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, did Petrov's story surface. By then, he was living quietly in a crumbling apartment block. Eventually, the West recognized his act for what it was, the decision that saved humanity. The United Nations Secretary General honored him as the man who prevented nuclear war. Still, Petrov was haunted for the rest of his life. He often reflected on how close the world had come to destruction. Hey, and how everything had hung on a single choice by a single man. He told one reporter, "In the end, you still need a person to order a longhand. A person can always make a mistake." Stanislav Petrov died on May 19, 2017, at the age of 77. His encyclopedia entry concludes simply, he is survived by his 2 children, 2 grandchildren, and the entire human race.